The film begins by showing a man named Richard Williams, a former tennis athlete who lives in California with his wife, Brandy, and his 3 stepdaughters, and also his 2 biological daughters, called Venus and Serena. Ever since his retirement, Richard has aspired to turn Venus and Serena into professional tennis players, and he has been planning to make his dreams come true even before his daughters are born. Tirelessly, Richard always went to professional tennis coaches and persuaded them to recruit his 2 daughters so that they could be accepted to practice at a professional tennis academy. Despite always getting rejected, Richard was not discouraged. Richard then took Venus and Serena to practice together in the park. Richard's 3 other daughters also joined in to support and encourage their sisters. However, while practicing, Richard's daughters were bullied by delinquent youths. Frankly, Richard did not stay silent. His daughters were treated like that. Richard then told his daughters to get into the car while he went up to the delinquents and reprimanded them. However, the delinquents actually felt insulted when Richard reprimanded them and then beat Richard in front of his daughters. Arriving at the house, Richard and his daughters were greeted by Brandy while preparing dinner. Despite living in a simple house with 5 daughters, Richard's family seems so harmonious and happy. After taking Venus and Serena to play tennis and to their respective tutoring places, Richard then gets ready to go to work because Richard has a job as a security guard. Meanwhile, Brandy, who works as a nurse during the day, is in charge of looking after their daughters at night and helping them with their homework. Even though their parents were busy working and taking turns taking care of them, Richard and Brandy's 5 daughters always did well in school and never lacked the love of their parents. One day, Richard went to one of the professional tennis coaches and persuaded the man to recruit his 2 daughters to train at a professional tennis academy. However, again Richard got rejected, where he openly told Richard that Richard must have a lot of money before sending his children to the most prestigious tennis academy. Hearing this, Richard immediately felt hurt and decided to leave there. That evening, Richard went to the park and pondered while thinking about the tennis coach's words. However, not long after, Richard got into a fight with the delinquents who previously disturbed his daughters. Richard then returned home battered. Seeing her husband's condition, Brandy did not say much and only focused on treating Richard. A few days later, Richard took Venus and Serena to see a professional tennis coach named Paul Cohen, who was training with famous tennis players. Richard intended to show Venus and Serena's skills firsthand, so the coaches could assess them. Despite his initial objections, Cohen eventually agrees to test Venus and Serena's tennis skills, where he ends up being very impressed with their abilities. Since Richard did not have enough money to pay for his 2 daughters' professional tennis training, Cohen was only willing to coach one of Richard's daughters for free. Cohen then decided to train Venus professionally. The next day, when Venus was about to leave for practice at Cohen's place, Venus tried to comfort Serena, who looked sad because she couldn't participate. Venus said that Serena didn't need to worry because their father would definitely record Venus's practice and Serena could learn from it. While Venus was training with Cohen, Richard recorded the whole thing and showed it to Brandy and Serena so they could both replicate the portion of the exercise. Even though Brandy is not a professional tennis player like Cohen, but her love is so great as a mother who wants to see her daughter succeed and able to make Serena excited even though she doesn't train with Cohen. One day after practice, Richard and Venus watched a professional tennis match on television with Cohen, during which Cohen suggested that Venus participate in a junior tennis tournament. Hearing this, Richard agreed to register Venus in a junior tennis tournament so that Venus's abilities could be known by many people and open up greater opportunities for her professional career in the future. In the following weeks, Venus entered various junior tennis tournaments and quickly found success due to her winning streak. However, Richard always emphasized to Venus and her sisters to remain humble despite their success. One night, when Richard had just returned from training with Venus and Serena, they were surprised by the presence of a Child Protection Service officer at their home. The officers from the Child Protection Service came because they thought that Richard had exploited his daughters by forcing them to practice tennis every day. Hearing these accusations, Richard immediately felt annoyed. Richard then explained to them that from the start, he had never forced anything on his daughters. Richard has only supported and helped his daughters to realize their dreams, whether it be to become a doctor, lawyer, or professional tennis player. Richard will do everything possible for his daughters to realize their dreams and achieve success. Having no evidence that Richard had exploited his daughters, the Child Protection Service officers finally left Richard's house. One day, Richard took his whole family with him to watch Venus compete. However, unbeknownst to Richard, Serena also secretly signed up to play in the tournament. While watching Venus match, a man told Richard that he was very impressed to see Richard's daughter named Serena, who was playing on another field. Hearing this, Richard and Brandy then decided to go to the field where Serena was competing. Seeing her father's presence, at first Serena was afraid because Richard would scold her. But apparently, Richard was proud of her and supported and encouraged his daughter during the game. At the end of the tournament, Venus won first place, while Serena won second. As both Venus and Serena continue to succeed, the family are treated as outsiders among the predominantly white upper-class competition. News of Venus and Serena's success in tennis tournaments has also spread everywhere, and the two of them are often invited to schools so that the students there are inspired by their achievements and to use their youth for positive activities and avoiding drugs. Richard meets with high-profile agents, but, fearing that his daughters will be taken advantage of, he pulls them out of the junior circuit entirely. Paul warns him that his decision will destroy the girls' chances to turn pro, but Richard stands firm, firing Paul as coach. After Cohen ceased to be Venus's coach, Richard began looking for a professional tennis coach who not only coached Venus to play tennis, but also provided educational scholarships for the girl. One of the tennis coaches, a man named Rick McSay, travels to California to see Venus and Serena play tennis in person. Impressed by the two girls' abilities, Rick decides to take Venus and Serena and their family to move to Florida to train at his facility. Even Rick has also provided a private home and a job for Richard if Richard and his family agree to move to Florida. Richard seems interested in Rick's offer, but he makes a condition, namely that Venus and Serena will only participate in any tournament with Richard's permission. If Richard considers that his daughters are not ready for a tournament, then they will not participate. At first, Rick was surprised to hear Richard's conditions because he planned to include Venus and Serena in many tournaments because he felt it was useless if Venus and Serena's great talent was buried just like that. After a long debate and discussion, Rick finally agreed to Richard's terms. Richard then brought his entire family to Florida. Because Richard had made it clear that Venus and Serena would only participate in tournaments according to his instructions, then for the next few years, Venus and Serena often practiced and attended school like children in general, because Richard had not allowed them to take part in any tournaments. He don't know what Richard was thinking, even though Venus and Serena have shown that their abilities have drastically improved. In the ensuing 3 years, questions arise from the media and from Rick about Richard's strategy with Venus and Serena and his desire for media exposure. One day, Venus tells Rick that she wants to become a professional tennis player and participate in the upcoming Bank of the West Classic tennis tournament in Oakland. Rick then tries to persuade Richard to let Venus participate. Although at first Richard refused, but after being convinced by Rick, he reluctantly gave his permission so that Venus could participate in the tennis tournament. But over dinner, Richard watches the news on television about one of Rick's pupils, Jennifer Capriati, who is suspected of suffering from burnout and being arrested for drug possession. Fearing that Venus would suffer the same fate as Jennifer, Richard immediately canceled Venus to participate in the tennis tournament. The next day, unable to find Venus and Serena on the field for practice, Rick goes to Richard's house and asks the reason why his daughters canceled practice when a tournament will be held soon. But Richard tells Rick that he has canceled Venus from the tournament because he wants Venus to focus on her schooling and spend her time like a normal teenager by studying and having fun. Richard did not want Venus to be stressed and depressed if she continued to participate in the tournament because he did not want his daughters to end up like Jennifer, who fell into the use of drugs. Rick again tries to convince Richard that Venus can be successful if she joins the tennis tournament and will not end up like Jennifer, but Richard persists. Rick finally chose to leave because he didn't want to argue further with Richard. On the other hand, Brandy and Venus had apparently overheard Rick and Richard's argument earlier. Brandy then reminded Richard not to make unilateral decisions regarding the future of their daughters without discussing it with her and their daughters first. Brandy said that Venus also has the right to determine her own desires for her future and also the happiness she wants. But Richard had only made his own decisions without ever asking Venus anything. Brandy said if Richard continued to act like that, Venus would stay away from Richard. Hearing his wife's words, Richard became aware that all this time he had been excessive because he was too protective of his daughters. In the evening, Richard then went to Venus, who was training alone, and revealed the reason he was so protective of his daughters. As a father, Richard just wants his daughter to be happy. Therefore, Richard finally decided to fully support Venus in the tournament. Getting approval from her father, Venus also seemed very happy and hugged her father tightly. Prior to the tournament, the family met with an executive from a well-known sports brand, who offered them a $3 million sponsorship deal. Richard then left the decision to Venus and willfully support whatever her decision. After considering it for a while, Venus decided to turn down the offer because she thought that the brand was just because of Venus's previous fame. Venus wants people to see her play first and judge for themselves how great she is. Although Rick urges them to accept, but the family collectively agrees to decline, believing that once Venus begins to play, she will attract more lucrative offers. Finally, the day of the tournament arrived. Although Venus had a hard time at first in her first professional match against Shawn Stafford. However, Richard kept encouraging her and asked Venus to have fun during the match regardless of the outcome, because Richard didn't want to burden his daughter to win. After getting support from her father and also her family, Venus finally managed to win. Venus comes in as a heavy underdog in her next match against top-seeded Arantxa Sanchez Vicario. After seeing Venus compete and win, the sports brand, which previously offered a $3 million contract, increased their bid to $4 million. Rick continues to convince Richard to accept the offer. But Richard still respects Venus's decision to reject the offer. After the match, Richard saw Serena, who was staring at the tennis court where her sister had previously played. Richard realized that Serena might be jealous of Venus's success. Richard then encouraged his daughter by saying that one day, Venus will become the #1 female tennis athlete in the world, while Serena will become the greatest female tennis athlete of all time, and Richard strongly believes in her. So what Serena needs to do right now is to stay focused on her schooling and keep training hard. On the day of the next match, for the first time in her life, Venus felt everyone cheer her on as she entered the court to compete. Venus takes the first set and leads in the second, before Vicario takes an extended bathroom break, an apparent act of gamesmanship. Rick and Richard realized that it was a trick Vicario used to make Venus feel nervous, because she hadn't competed in a long time amid thousands of pairs of eyes staring at her. The audience began to question when Vicario would return, and their words made Venus even more nervous and mentally down. After that, Vicario was finally back on the field, and as Rick and Richard had predicted, Vicario's trick worked. Vicario recovers to win the second set and finally win the match. Richard and Brandy comforted dejected Venus, telling her to be proud. As the family leaves the stadium, a large crowd of supporters is waiting to cheer her on, and Rick tells Richard that several major shoe companies are anxious to meet with Venus. An epilogue reveals that 9 months later, at the age of 15, Venus would sign a contract with Reebok for $12 million. Venus would go on to win Wimbledon 5 times and become the first African-American woman to be ranked #1 in the world during the Open era. Serena, who joined Venus as a professional 2 years later, would become a 23-time Grand Slam champion and considered perhaps the greatest player in tennis history, just as Richard predicted. The moral of this film is that as parents, of course we must support and strive to make whatever dreams come true for our children. Even so, we also must not impose our wills and ambitions and ignore our children, who also have the right to determine their own happiness and have fun with their friends. On the other hand, we are also taught to keep trying and fighting hard to realize all our dreams and achieve success now or in the future.